Last Christmas Eve, I arrived at my parents' estate with my 7-year-old daughter, Lily, bundled up beside me in her red wool coat, the one with tiny white buttons shaped like snowflakes. The driveway was already lined with luxury cars, expensive models I didn't recognize, their polished exteriors reflecting the soft glow of golden fairy lights strung across the mansion's facade. As we walked through the grand front doors I had once run through as a child, the familiar scent of pine, cinnamon, and polished wood hit me. The massive Christmas tree in the foyer reached almost to the ceiling, adorned with glass ornaments and thick silver garland. A pianist played live in the corner of the parlor, and waitstaff in black bow ties floated through the room carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I held Lily's hand tighter as we stepped in. She looked around with wide eyes, overwhelmed but curious. I leaned down and whispered, "Just stay close to me, sweetheart." She nodded, her curls bouncing slightly as she did. We had dressed as best we could, her coat was second-hand, but clean and warm, and I wore my nicest dress, a navy wrap I had bought years ago when I still had a stable job. In this room, though, surrounded by designer labels and expensive jewelry, we stood out immediately. My mother was the first to see us. She descended the staircase slowly, in a floor-length silver gown that shimmered under the chandelier. Her lips formed a tight, practiced smile. "You came," she said, her voice coated with something between surprise and annoyance. "And you brought her." She didn't even look at Lily as she said it. I forced a smile and replied, "Merry Christmas, Mom." We moved awkwardly through the room, guests eyeing us with thinly veiled curiosity. Some I recognized, old family friends, business associates of my father, a few of my cousins, but none approached. I could feel their judgment, and more than that, their confusion. I hadn't been invited to Christmas at the mansion in years. The only reason I was here now was because my father had extended a reluctant invitation after a strained phone call where I'd begged to let Lily at least see her grandparents for the holidays. After a few minutes of standing awkwardly by the fireplace, my father approached, glass of scotch in hand. He gave me a stiff nod and barely acknowledged Lily. "You look tired," he said, as if it were some form of greeting. "Lily's grown." I nodded. "She's 7 now. Smart, too. Reading chapter books already." He sipped his drink and gave a noncommittal grunt, looking past me at a group of men laughing near the bar. Dinner was announced shortly after, and we were ushered into the grand dining room, with its long mahogany table that could seat 30. The table was set with gold-rimmed china, and each place had a name card. Lily and I were seated at the very end, far from my parents and their inner circle. She fidgeted in her chair, and I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze under the table. The meal was extravagant, prime rib, roasted duck, truffle mashed potatoes, dishes I hadn't tasted in years. But as the courses came and went, I noticed how the conversation never included us. No one asked about Lily, or about me. It was like we were invisible. Until we weren't. Dessert was being served when my cousin Erin, drunk and loud as always, pointed her fork down the table and said, "Didn't you get knocked up by some bartender or something?" The room went silent. My hand froze over my plate. Lily looked up at me, confused. "What was his name again?" Erin continued, giggling. "Chad? Brad? Something classy, I'm sure." My face burned. I stared at my plate, willing myself not to react. But my father's voice cut through the silence. "That's enough, Erin." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he was going to defend me. But then he added, "This is not the time." Not that it was inappropriate, just not the right time. The message was clear. He wasn't defending me. He was embarrassed. I stood up slowly. "Come on, Lily," I said quietly. My daughter looked up at me with wide eyes, her little hand finding mine. I could feel everyone's eyes on us. No one said anything. No one stopped us. As I led her back through the parlor, past the tree, and toward the front door, my mother's voice called out behind me. "You always make everything about you." I stopped, turned slightly. "No, Mom. You do. Every single time." And then I walked out. It was snowing softly outside. I got Lily buckled into the back seat of our beat-up sedan and climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking. She was quiet for a while, then finally asked, "Did I do something wrong?" I turned to her quickly. "No, baby. Never. None of this is your fault." As I drove away from the mansion, Christmas lights fading in the rearview mirror, I realized that whatever hope I'd been clinging to, that maybe they'd changed, maybe we could be a family again, was gone. I had shown up looking for connection, for warmth, maybe even a bit of forgiveness. But what I got was a reminder of exactly why I had left in the first place. We hadn't even been in the house for 15 minutes before my mother, Patricia, made sure to leave a scar my daughter wouldn't forget. It happened in the living room, right in front of the tree that looked like something out of a holiday magazine, perfectly symmetrical, covered in crystal ornaments, and flanked by an ocean of wrapped gifts in silver and red foil. Lily had been staring at the presents, not expectantly, just curiously, the way any child would. She wasn't touching anything. She wasn't asking questions. She was just looking, her head tilted slightly, her eyes scanning the tags as if trying to find one with her name. She didn't say anything, didn't ask, didn't whine. She just looked. My mother noticed. Of course she did. Her voice, always sharp and rehearsed, cut through the low hum of conversation like a scalpel. She didn't call Lily's name. She didn't even look at me first. She just turned to my daughter, her posture rigid, her wine glass balanced perfectly between two manicured fingers, and said, "We didn't know you existed, sweetheart. No gifts for you this year." The room fell into that kind of uneasy pause, not complete silence, but a hesitating quiet, where everyone waits to see how awkward things will get before deciding how to react. Then someone chuckled. Then another. And then the room followed. Laughter, not hysterical or cruel, just the kind that spills out when adults are uncomfortable and want to brush past something messy. Like it was a joke. Like that was supposed to be funny. But it wasn't. Not to Lily. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She didn't look confused. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, frozen in her little brown boots, her small fingers clutched around the edge of her coat like she was trying to anchor herself to something. Her eyes locked onto my mother, and I watched it happen. I watched the innocence in her expression crack ever so slightly. Just enough to let something darker settle in. One tear slid down her cheek, completely silent. She didn't even flinch. Just one tear. And then she looked at me. That look broke something in me I hadn't realized was still intact. I could take 1,000 digs from my mother. I'd been taking them for decades. Her snide comments, her backhanded compliments, her surgical cruelty masked as civility. I knew how to brace for it, how to wear armor. But my daughter didn't. She shouldn't have to. I walked over and kneeled down beside her, cupping her face gently with both hands, my thumbs brushing her cheeks. Her skin was cold. "You did nothing wrong," I whispered, low enough that only she could hear it. "You are loved. And you belong. You hear me?" She nodded faintly, her bottom lip quivering. I kissed her forehead and stood up slowly, my body trembling with a mix of rage and restraint. I turned to my mother. She had already moved on, sipping her wine, laughing with someone about a story from a ski trip to Vail. She wasn't even looking at us. To her, the moment was over. Forgotten. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to grab one of those glittering gifts and hurl it across the room. But I didn't. Not in front of Lily. Not here. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked over to the hallway closet, grabbed our coats, and started putting hers back on. My father noticed. He came over, wearing a forced smile, and asked, "Leaving already?" I didn't answer. He looked down at Lily, then back at me, and said, "Patricia was just, you know how she is. Don't make a scene." The words hit me like ice water. It was the same thing he had said my whole life, in different forms. Always minimizing. Always excusing. Always expecting me to absorb it quietly. I buttoned up Lily's coat and looked up at him. "I'm not making a scene," I said, my voice steady, even calm. "I'm protecting my daughter." I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait for anyone else to notice we were leaving. I just took her hand, opened the front door, and walked us out into the cold. The laughter inside continued as the door shut behind us. The warmth, the lights, the clinking of glasses, all of it muffled instantly. Outside, the air was sharp and still. Snow had started to fall again, soft flakes catching in Lily's hair. I brushed them away as we walked to the car, my heart pounding. She didn't say anything until we were both inside, the heater just starting to kick in. Then, in the smallest voice, she said, "I didn't know they didn't know about me." I looked at her, really looked at her, this tiny, brilliant, brave human who had already endured more emotional neglect in one evening than any child should. They knew, baby. They just chose to forget. 2 weeks before Christmas Eve, while I was sitting at my kitchen table sorting unpaid bills and school notices, my phone buzzed with an email notification that immediately made my stomach tighten when I saw the sender's name. Patricia. Not Mom, not even her full name with any warmth attached, just Patricia, as formal and distant as she always became when she wanted to remind me where I stood. The email itself was short, clinical, and stripped of any pretense of affection. There was no greeting, no hope you're well, no acknowledgement of Lily as her granddaughter beyond a single line that felt deliberately engineered to wound. She wrote that this year's Christmas gift exchange would be limited to immediate family members who meet established family standards, and that Lily would not be included. Not might not be included, not that it was complicated or unfortunate, but that she would not be included, full stop. As if my daughter were an administrative inconvenience rather than a child. I remember reading that sentence over and over again, trying to understand how someone could reduce a 7-year-old to a disqualifying detail. The justification came in the next paragraph, carefully worded to sound reasonable while being anything but. Patricia explained that certain associations had made it difficult for the family to maintain its reputation, and that while they were willing to tolerate my presence for the sake of the holiday, extending that generosity further would be inappropriate. Then came the line that made my hands shake so badly I had to put the phone down. She referenced my late husband's incarceration, stating that his past actions had permanently stained the family name and that it would be irresponsible to ignore that reality when considering traditions, appearances, and the example being set for younger relatives. My husband had been dead for 3 years by then. He had made terrible mistakes, yes, but he had also been Lily's father, and he had loved her deeply. To see his worst chapter weaponized against our child, reduced to a justification for exclusion, made something inside me go cold. Patricia didn't mention Lily by name again. She referred to her only as the child, as if that created emotional distance, as if stripping her of her name made the cruelty cleaner. The email ended with a passive-aggressive assurance that this decision was not personal, that it was simply about maintaining consistency and values, followed by a polite suggestion that if I felt uncomfortable attending under these circumstances, I was free to make other arrangements for Christmas. I remember staring at that sentence, realizing it was never meant to be a suggestion at all. It was a challenge. A reminder that I was disposable, and that Lily was optional at best. I didn't respond right away. I sat there in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Lily playing in her room, humming to herself as she lined up her stuffed animals. I thought about telling her. I thought about how her face would fall if she knew her grandparents had already decided she didn't belong before even seeing her. I couldn't do it. So I didn't say anything. I told myself that maybe if we showed up anyway, maybe if they saw her smile, heard her laugh, watched her say thank you and please like she always did, something might soften in them. I told myself that surely they wouldn't say something so cruel out loud, not in front of her, not on Christmas Eve. Looking back, that email wasn't a warning. It was a setup. It was Patricia making sure she had plausible deniability when the damage was done, a written record she could fall back on to say she had been clear, that expectations had been set, that any pain caused was the result of my choices, not hers. I walked into that house already knowing Lily would be excluded, already knowing she would be treated as lesser, and I still went, because some part of me was foolish enough to hope that blood would outweigh pride. That email sat unread in my inbox on Christmas Eve, flagged but unanswered, like a quiet confession I had tried to ignore, and by the time my mother spoke those words to Lily in the living room, I understood with horrifying clarity that nothing that happened that night was accidental. That night, as I stood in the corner of the grand living room, its marble floors gleaming under the golden light of a chandelier the size of my entire living room back home, I watched the performance of wealth unfold in front of me like a grotesque holiday pageant. My brother Jeff, tall, smug, and perfectly groomed in his tailored navy blazer and designer loafers, held court at the center of it all, laughing loudly with a glass of something dark and aged in his hand. His wife Brooke, draped in diamonds that sparkled with every careless flick of her wrist, floated between guests like a queen hosting a royal gala, her surgically frozen smile never faltering. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, all under the age of 10, were on the floor surrounded by a mountain of expensive wrapping paper and gifts so lavish they looked like product placements in a luxury catalog. There were drones, gaming consoles, custom sneakers, limited edition toys flown in from Europe, and gadgets I couldn't even name. One of the boys actually groaned, when he unwrapped something that wasn't on his main list. Brooke chuckled and told him not to worry, there were still more presents to come. The other guests, equally overdressed and overindulged, sipped champagne and snapped photos, capturing the curated chaos like it was all part of a seasonal magazine spread titled, How the Successful Celebrate Christmas. Lily sat quietly next to me on the edge of an ottoman, her tiny hands folded in her lap, still wearing her coat because the house never felt warm in a way that invited you to take your layers off. Her eyes, tired and too aware for a child her age, flicked between the cousins she barely knew, who hadn't acknowledged her even once since we arrived. Not one of them had spoken to her. Not one had asked if she wanted to play, or offered to share a toy. She wasn't just excluded, she was invisible. I kept glancing at her, praying she wouldn't start to cry again, but she didn't. That was somehow worse. She just sat there quietly, taking it all in, understanding in her own way what it meant to be tolerated, not welcomed. I knew she was trying to stay strong for me, and that realization landed like a punch to the gut. She was 7 years old. She shouldn't have to be strong. She shouldn't have to pretend she wasn't hurt just to protect me from feeling worse. Every part of the room screamed excess. The table with hand-painted macarons that no one touched. The floral arrangements that cost more than my monthly rent. The violinist playing live in the next room, barely noticed by anyone. But none of it masked the emptiness that pulsed beneath the surface. These people weren't gathered in love. They were gathered in ritual, in reputation, in status maintenance. It wasn't Christmas, it was theater. And my daughter, my kind, gentle, beautiful child, was nothing but an unwanted extra in the background. I didn't say a word. I didn't make a scene. I stood there watching it all, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought I might crack a tooth. And in that still moment, surrounded by the gleam of polished silver and the rustle of designer paper being torn by children who had everything and felt nothing, I made a vow so quiet it was practically carved into bone, I would never let Lily feel this small again. I would never bring her into a place where her worth was questioned, her presence barely acknowledged, her spirit slowly dimmed by people who mistook wealth for value and cruelty for honesty. It was in that exact moment, my daughter sitting silently beside me while her cousins screamed over gifts they didn't even appreciate, while my brother and his wife basked in attention, while my parents floated through the room acting like this spectacle was something to be proud of, that I decided, with absolute certainty, that we were done. Done with all of it. The hierarchy, the judgment, the transactional version of love that came with conditions and caveats. I would give Lily a different life. One that might not have chandeliers or French macarons or gold-wrapped gifts, but one where she never had to wonder if she belonged. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, repurposed into a guest room long ago, thinking about every time I had tried to earn my place back into this family, every time I thought maybe if I was more patient, more forgiving, more understanding, they might soften. But watching Lily go unnoticed in a room full of people who claimed to be her family made one thing crystal clear: I didn't want back in. I wanted out. Forever. It happened just after dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the adults congregated in the sitting room with their wine glasses, leaning into conversations that reeked of self-congratulation and veiled comparisons. I was standing near the fireplace, trying to stay out of the way, sipping from a glass of lukewarm cider because I had politely declined the endless parade of wines and cocktails offered by the waitstaff. Lily was nearby, curled up quietly with a coloring book I had slipped into my purse earlier that day, the only semblance of normalcy I could give her in this cold, performative atmosphere. Jeff strolled over with the swagger of someone who had never heard the word no and had been praised for mediocrity his entire life. He wore a crisp button-down shirt under a wool vest that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, his Rolex glinting dramatically as he waved his hands around while talking to a group of my father's business associates. I hadn't said more than a few words to him since arriving, which suited me just fine. We had never been close, not as kids, not as adults. He'd always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, even when his mistakes cost other people everything. Especially then. He spotted me from across the room and smirked, like he'd just remembered I existed. Still playing with spreadsheets and middle market numbers, he said, loud enough to catch the attention of several nearby guests. I heard you're managing one of those boutique funds. That's cute. I didn't answer right away. I just watched him, waiting to see how far he would go, wondering if he even remembered the truth, or if he ever knew it to begin with. Before I could say a word, he launched into a boast about his latest project, a massive waterfront development on the coast, something about exclusive villas and luxury retail spaces. He described it with exaggerated grandeur, peppering in words like visionary and legacy, as if he had personally laid the foundation stones. He made it sound like a solo triumph, a feat of entrepreneurial genius. Then he turned back to me and added, with a grin so smug it was almost cartoonish, "Not sure it's something someone in your bracket would fully grasp. But don't worry, when we launch the lifestyle magazine, I'll make sure you get a free copy. You'll love the pictures." The group around him laughed, polite, complicit chuckles that told me they weren't really listening, just responding to social cues. He looked so pleased with himself, so confident that he had scored some clever jab, so sure that I was just his sister scraping by in the finance world while he built empires. What he didn't know, or perhaps what he had conveniently forgotten, was that his entire waterfront project had been made possible by a bridge loan I had arranged 2 years ago, quietly, through a private investment vehicle I managed off books for a group of silent partners. He had no idea that the early capital infusion that allowed him to close on the land acquisition came from a fund I personally vetted, structured, and approved. My name wasn't on the paperwork. That had been intentional. He had approached one of my clients, not knowing our relationship, desperate for funding when his original investors backed out due to some zoning issues that nearly killed the deal. I had seen the proposal, recognized the name on the LLC, and decided, against my better judgment, to greenlight it, never thinking I would one day be mocked over eggnog in the same breath he used to brag about it. I looked at him then, really looked at him. All bluster, no backbone. A man whose success had always been built on other people's resources, other people's forgiveness, and a system that rewarded performance over substance. I could have said something. I could have dropped a single sentence that would have obliterated the illusion he had crafted for himself. But I didn't. Because the insult wasn't about money. It wasn't about career paths or development deals. It was about power. He wanted me small. He wanted me irrelevant. And in that moment, I realized that he, and everyone else in that room, had no idea just how much of their world still spun because I kept certain gears turning in silence. I gave him a faint smile, the kind that only comes when you're done pretending. "You're right," I said. "It's probably beyond me." And then I walked away, not because I was conceding anything, but because I knew the truth, and so did the balance sheets. His triumph wasn't his. And I would never again let anyone in that room treat me like I was less than the force that had kept so many of their illusions afloat. I walked out of the sitting room with my spine straight and my heart pounding like a war drum inside my chest. The murmurs behind me faded as I moved through the hallway, past the perfectly curated art pieces, past the antique console table with the crystal bowl no one was allowed to touch, past the smell of rosemary and melted wax and the ghosts of every holiday that had made me feel small. I stopped near the side entrance, just outside the view of the main gathering, and pulled out my phone with fingers that had finally stopped trembling. I stared at the screen for a moment, my reflection looking back at me in the glass. There was no more hesitation. Not an ounce left. I tapped the number of my portfolio manager, Steve, a calm, capable man I trusted with the architecture of everything I had built from the ashes of the life they thought I had ruined. The call connected on speaker almost immediately. "Evening, Natalie," he said, cheerful and oblivious to the firestorm about to unfold. "Everything all right?" "Hi, Steve," I said, my voice steady and deliberate, louder than usual. I wasn't hiding. "I need to initiate a freeze. Effective immediately. Halt all monthly distributions from Trust Account 4. There was a slight pause on the line. "All of them?" "Yes. All of them," I confirmed. "Both transfers. 10,000 monthly to the Glenridge account, under Patricia Dempsey. And 8,000 to Heritage Holdings, listed under Jeffrey Dempsey. Full suspension. No notice, no delay. Starting now." He didn't question me. He didn't need to. I had full discretion. I'd been the architect of those trusts, the unseen hand keeping the wheels greased. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. The same family that had reduced me to an afterthought was living off my silent generosity. They never asked where the money came from. They assumed it was some legacy fund left behind by our father's estate planning, or maybe an old investment from when times were good. They had never bothered to ask. They had never thought it might be me. "Understood," Steve said, already typing. "Should I send confirmation?" Send the receipts, I said. To me directly. I'll handle the rest. Done, he replied. Anything else? No. Thank you, Steve. The moment the call ended, I stood still for a few seconds, breathing in the charged silence that only comes before detonation. Then I turned around and walked back toward the sitting room. The atmosphere hadn't changed, music playing softly, wine being poured, laughter too loud and too false, but I no longer cared about composure or civility or sparing anyone's feelings. My daughter had been humiliated, I had been mocked, and now it was time to return the favor, this time not with words, but with truth. I stepped into the room and all eyes drifted toward me, some out of habit, others sensing the shift in air pressure. I pulled up the email confirmation from Steve, my phone screen glowing bright in the dim light of the parlor, and walked straight toward my mother, who was delicately arranging petit fours on a porcelain serving platter like a hostess in a 1950s ad. I didn't say anything, just stood there, holding the screen up for her to see. Her eyes flicked to the email, the transaction history, the freeze notice. Her hand twitched. The platter slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor with a deafening shatter, scattering broken porcelain and sugared pastries across the rug. The room went dead silent. Across the room, Jeff's head snapped around. He must have caught a glimpse of the subject line on my phone, something about trust disbursement freeze and his company's name. He moved fast, pushing past a coffee table and two stunned guests, his face contorted with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he barked, grabbing for my phone. I pulled it back, calm, controlled. "It's your new reality," I said. 6 years. Every month. That waterfront project you're so proud of? It was built with money you didn't earn. And now it's gone. You can't just, he started, his voice rising with panic. "Oh, but I can," I said. "I have. It's done. You should have read the fine print." The room was frozen in a tableau of shock. Patricia stood pale and trembling, staring at the shards of her shattered serving dish like it was the ground breaking open beneath her. Jeff looked like he might throw something. Brooke had stopped pretending to care about appearances and was frantically texting someone, likely trying to confirm the numbers she had never bothered to understand. I looked around the room, scanning the faces of people who had spent the evening treating me like I was barely worth acknowledging. I let them sit in that discomfort, let them stew in the sudden realization that the daughter they ignored, the sister they mocked, had been underwriting their illusion of success for over half a decade. No more. I turned and walked toward the door without another word. I didn't need to explain. The numbers did that for me. The transfers. The withdrawals. The power they never even realized I held. They had spent years mistaking silence for weakness. Tonight, they learned the truth. The moment I froze the payments was only the first crack. What followed was the full collapse of the carefully staged illusion they had all built around themselves, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, on the back of a trust that was never meant to serve them. I hadn't even intended to go further than that. But once Patricia dropped the platter and Jeff lunged at me with a face full of panic and entitlement, something deeper snapped. Years of restraint dissolved. I opened the receipts not just to prove I could stop the flow, but to expose exactly where the money had gone. I stood in the middle of the room, raised my phone again, opened the portfolio app, and pulled up the allocation history. "Since you're all so interested," I said, projecting my voice just enough to cut through the tension, "let me show you what that money was actually doing while you were pretending I didn't exist." Everyone stared, uncertain whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. I tapped to enlarge the transaction ledger and began to read. $180,000 in tuition payments, I said, scrolling slowly. Directly wired to Chesterfield Prep under the name of Connor Dempsey. I looked up at Jeff, who had gone pale. "That's your son, right? The one who just got accepted to Yale early decision?" "You're welcome." I didn't pause for dramatic effect. I wasn't performing. I was just done lying to protect people who would have let me and my daughter rot without a second thought. $52,000 to a corporate card in Brooke's name. Mostly high-end retail. Chanel, Hermes, Balmain. Looks like someone enjoyed the Paris trip last spring. Brooke's mouth dropped open, but she didn't deny it. She just glanced at Jeff, then back at me, calculating. I kept going. Monthly transfers to Patricia and Richard Dempsey, $10,000. Every month. 6 years. Covered your property taxes, your housekeeper, even the landscaping bills. You always said the estate was self-sustaining, but no. That was Lily's trust footing the bill. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her hands trembling at her sides. She wasn't horrified by the truth. She was horrified that I had pulled back the curtain for everyone else to see. You used my daughter's money to fund this whole circus, I said, quieter now, but sharper. The trust was set up after her father died. It was his last protection for her. I managed it. I grew it. I made decisions to preserve it, to invest it wisely. And I let you draw from it because I thought, for a moment, that keeping the family stable might one day help her feel like she belonged. I thought maybe this place could be safe for her. I thought maybe you'd change. The room was dead silent. No one moved. Even the background music had stopped, the speaker left running on a low battery now silent as if the house itself understood the weight of what had been said. But you didn't change, I continued. You saw the account and didn't even ask whose name was on it. You just assumed. Assumed you deserved it. That you were entitled to the kind of security Lily never had. That you could strip her inheritance down to the bone and still call yourselves family. Jeff tried to recover first, stepping forward with his voice low, attempting some twisted version of reason. You managed the account. You could have said no. I turned to him, unflinching. And you could have asked where it came from. You could have taken a single second to wonder whether the money you were using to build your little empire was yours to spend. But you didn't. Because you never cared. Brooke, ever the opportunist, muttered something about not being aware, trying to distance herself. I ignored her. My focus was on the foundation shaking beneath them. Because that was the truth, they weren't shaken by the betrayal of their own actions. They weren't ashamed that they had mocked my career, erased my daughter, used my generosity like a tap they never imagined would run dry. No. What terrified them was the financial reality, the sudden, irrevocable halt to their unearned comfort. Jeff's hands were already on his phone, no doubt checking balances, texts flying off to his CFO, probably trying to verify how much of his precious development fund had been exposed. Patricia sat down slowly in the high-backed chair near the window, one hand still trembling, muttering about miscommunication and family confusion, as though this were all some accounting error. But I wasn't listening anymore. I'd said what needed to be said. They would survive, of course. They always found a way to survive. But they would do it without me. Without my money. Without Lily's trust propping up their lives. They had built a house of cards with their names etched into the top floor and convinced themselves it was made of stone. All I did was remove the foundation they never once thought to thank. And as I turned and walked back toward Lily, still curled up with her crayons on the side chair, I felt the weight begin to lift, not from what I had lost, but from what I had finally let go. By the time the room had begun to splinter under the weight of everything I had already laid bare, the frozen disbursements, the exposed tuition, the designer statements, and the unspoken truth that their entire lifestyle was a sculpture built atop a trust meant for my child, I knew I had one final nail to drive in. And it wasn't just symbolic. It was structural. It was the pillar none of them even realized was load-bearing. The one they assumed would always quietly hold steady under the crushing weight of their self-importance. I waited until the shock began to settle in their expressions, until Jeff's furious tapping on his phone slowed, until Patricia stopped muttering to herself and started blinking back the reality that no one was going to step in to fix this for her. And then, in a tone so calm it almost sounded rehearsed, I said, "There's one more thing." All eyes snapped back to me. "You remember the reverse mortgage on the house," I began, locking eyes with Patricia first, then letting my gaze fall on my father, who had remained unnervingly quiet throughout everything, gripping the armrest of his chair like it might float him above the wreckage. 900,000. Brokered 6 years ago. Structured as a quiet solution when the liquidity issues started showing up in the portfolio. Patricia's lips parted, and I could see the exact moment she remembered. Her expression wasn't confused. It was dread. Because she knew what was coming. You needed cash, but you didn't want to sell off the family's image. So you took the loan against the house, this house, but you didn't qualify on your own. Not with the inheritance misallocated, not with the retirement portfolio underperforming. So you asked me. You called me, crying, said you just needed help for a little while, said you'd find a way to pay it off long before the balloon clause ever came into play. I didn't believe a word of it, but I still co-signed. Jeff's face twisted into confusion, then anger. Wait, what mortgage? He demanded, looking between them. What the hell is she talking about? Patricia didn't answer. She was frozen. Because she knew what I was going to say next, and she had no rebuttal prepared. For the first time all evening, there was no excuse waiting on her tongue. I stepped further into the room, standing beneath the massive oil painting of my great-grandparents that had watched over this family's dysfunction for generations. I've just submitted notice of withdrawal on the guarantee. As of today, I am no longer legally backing that mortgage. My voice didn't waver. I made sure they understood. And without my name on the agreement, the contract triggers immediate reassessment of the loan's viability. Which means full repayment. Every last cent of that $900,000 is now due in full, effective January 1st. New Year's Day. It was like I'd detonated a bomb in the center of the room. Patricia's breath hitched audibly, and her hand reached for the side table as if she might faint. Jeff turned to her, absolutely livid now. You mortgaged the house? You mortgaged the house and didn't say a word? His voice cracked, the fury and panic curling together in his throat. You let her co-sign on that? Brooke said, now standing, her tone sharp with disbelief and fear. What happens if you can't pay it back? What happens to the house? They'll repossess it, I said, flatly. They'll seize the asset. Eviction would begin within 30 days of default. Technically, they can list the property the same week the repayment becomes due. You might still get an offer or two, if you're lucky. You can't do this, Patricia finally gasped, barely able to form the words. You would let them take our home? No, I replied. You did that. When you chose to tie your legacy to a lie. When you used my daughter's trust to float your lifestyle while feeding her crumbs. When you welcomed us into your home for Christmas only to humiliate her in front of strangers. You made that choice. I'm just refusing to carry the consequences of it any longer. Jeff paced the room like a trapped animal, hands in his hair, muttering numbers, doing mental math he clearly didn't understand. Brooke had stepped into the hallway, on the phone now, her voice low and urgent. My father said nothing, eyes trained on the carpet, probably wondering how all his quiet enabling had ended here, on the verge of foreclosure, in front of everyone. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. Because they all realized it at once, the safety net was gone. The fallback plan, the quiet benefactor they never acknowledged, the sister they laughed off, the daughter they pitied, she had cut the cord. And there was no one left to catch them. They hadn't cared when they excluded Lily. They hadn't cared when they belittled me, mocked my career, or used my money. But now they cared. Because the money was gone. And the walls were coming down. While they stood stunned in that cavernous, over-decorated sitting room, surrounded by the ruins of their illusion of control, I slipped away. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't announce my next move. I didn't raise my voice or slam a door. I simply walked out into the night, with Lily's small hand folded in mine, and left them behind in a silence thick with unraveling. The cold air outside bit into my skin, but I welcomed it, it was cleaner than the rot I had just walked through. I buckled Lily into the back seat, made sure she was warm, then slid behind the wheel and pulled out of the driveway for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't go home. Not yet. I drove to the city, to the law offices that had represented me through every stage of building and managing Lily's trust. My attorney, Harris Klein, was already waiting by the time I arrived. His tone on the phone had been clipped, serious, but not surprised. He knew what this family had done in pieces, over the years, but even he had not expected the scale of it. I laid it all out for him, every transfer, every email, every withdrawal they made under the false assumption that I would never say no. He listened carefully, made notes, asked a few sharp legal questions, and then brought in Amanda Rice, the trust manager assigned to oversee our high-risk portfolios, including the silent equity stake we held in Jeff's waterfront project. We worked through the night. By midnight, the paperwork to terminate the mortgage guarantee was processed and sent to the lender with formal notice, triggering the repayment clause effective immediately. I signed the final documents with a hand that no longer trembled. Patricia and Richard's financial time bomb had officially started counting down. But that wasn't enough. Not for what they had done to Lily. Not for the years of parasitic behavior, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the smugness of people who thought they'd never face consequences. So I leaned in and said to Amanda, "Pull the equity." She hesitated. All of it? All of it, I said. Every cent of our exposure. I want out of his books before the markets open. Our fund, Lily's fund, had backed Jeff's development project with a silent equity stake of $1.5 million, acquired quietly through a third-party shell, structured specifically to shield our identity. It had been my way of keeping the family stable, of believing, even then, that I could contribute without giving them control. But now that investment became a lever, and I was going to use it. By sunrise, the liquidation order had been executed. Our shares were withdrawn, the capital yanked out, and the financial structure of the project began to list sideways under the weight of the sudden loss. Jeff had built his empire on high leverage and even higher risk, short-term bridge loans, investor confidence, and an absurdly inflated valuation model that had been floating only because no one had looked closely enough. But when $1.5 million in committed capital vanished overnight, the lenders did exactly that. By 10 a.m., his bridge loan provider froze disbursements. By 11:15, the mezzanine investors started calling in guarantees. By 11:45, the construction firm walked off-site. And by noon, Jeff Dempsey, heir to the Dempsey name, self-proclaimed real estate visionary, darling of local business media, was officially in default, and his company was on the brink of legal insolvency. I didn't call him. I didn't return his calls either. My inbox flooded with voicemails, texts, even an email or two from Brooke, pleading for me to reconsider, to pause and talk, to think of the family. But I had thought of the family. I thought of the little girl who sat silently on an ottoman while her grandmother humiliated her. I thought of every time they laughed at me while taking my money. I thought of the shame, the exclusion, the lies. And then I thought of the trust, what it was meant to be, and how close they had come to draining it dry. No. There would be no reconsideration. By the time Lily and I sat down for lunch in a quiet diner far from the mansion, the headlines were already trickling into the business feeds. Local developer faces unexpected setback, waterfront project stalled amid capital flight, Dempsey Holdings in default talks. I skimmed them briefly on my phone while Lily focused on her grilled cheese, completely unaware of the firestorm she had just been freed from. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just read, sipped my coffee, and watched my daughter eat in peace, knowing that, for the first time in years, the people who had taken so much would finally have to learn how to live without taking anything more. Christmas morning started with quiet. Lily woke me just after 7, climbing gently onto the bed in our small 2-bedroom apartment, whispering that it was Christmas. Her voice was soft, unsure, as if she wasn't quite convinced it was still something we were allowed to celebrate after what had happened the night before. I pulled her into my arms, kissed the top of her head, and told her yes, of course it was. We stayed like that for a while, just wrapped in each other under the blanket, her breath warm against my neck, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence. I had already wrapped her gifts, modest, thoughtful things she had mentioned months ago and then forgotten about, a set of watercolor paints, a second-hand telescope, a paperback box set of her favorite series. No diamond bracelets. No overwrapped designer packages. Just real, intentional joy. I made pancakes, she made a mess, and for the first time in what felt like years, Christmas morning belonged to us. No pressure, no audience, no silent judgment sitting like frost on the windows. And then my phone started buzzing. First, it was just a few texts. Then the alerts began stacking, one after another, calls, voicemails, emails, message requests from numbers I didn't recognize. The screen lit up so fast I had to mute it to stop it from vibrating off the table. I picked it up, expecting damage control, and what I got instead was the full, ugly symphony of the fallout. Patricia's first message was a wall of text so long it broke into 3 separate bubbles. It started with faux concern, how she woke up in tears and couldn't believe how far I was willing to go just to punish them. She said the house was under legal review and I hope you're happy now, followed by a list of things she had supposedly sacrificed for me over the years, private school tuition, violin lessons, ballet classes I never even asked for, and how this was the thanks she got. Then came the guilt. Your father hasn't spoken since last night. You've destroyed Christmas. This will follow Lily forever. The classic Patricia crescendo, every statement carefully constructed to place blame while appearing wounded. Not a single line about what she did. Not one word acknowledging Lily's name in a way that meant something. Jeff's first message was short and venomous. You vindictive bitch. The next said, I hope you know you've ruined lives. And then, I'm going to sue you. That one made me laugh, quietly, bitterly. He had no grounds. No standing. No leverage. But the desperation was pouring out of him now, in bursts of anger sent from a man who had finally realized his kingdom had no foundation. I didn't respond. I didn't even open the rest. I could feel what was coming next. Brooke's name popped up about an hour later. She hadn't written me directly. The message was part of a group chat I didn't remember ever being part of, probably created years ago for event planning. She posted a single message, taking the kids to my parents. Don't call. Then she left the group. Another 10 minutes passed, and then the phone rang again. This time it was Jeff. I didn't answer. He called again. Again. The fifth time, I picked up, not out of curiosity, but because I knew he wouldn't stop otherwise. He didn't even say hello. The second I pressed accept, his voice cracked through the line. You wanted this, didn't you? His voice was hoarse, broken. You wanted to watch everything burn. I didn't reply. I could hear him crying. Actually crying. Choking on the weight of his own implosion. He kept talking, about how the investors had backed out, about how he was trying to secure new funding, about how Brooke had left with the kids without even packing his things, about how no one was returning his calls, about how no one respected him anymore. He said the word respect like it was something owed, something he had been denied by my actions, not something he had lost through his own. I let him speak for a minute, maybe two. Then I said only this, Merry Christmas, Jeff. And I hung up. I didn't wait for him to call back. I blocked the number. Then I blocked Patricia. Then every other number tied to that house, that name, that life I had tried for too long to keep stitched together with patience and silence. It was done now. Really done. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt clean. Quiet. Free in a way I hadn't felt since before Lily was born, before I'd spent years believing I had to keep the peace, carry the burden, absorb the damage. I put the phone away and walked back into the living room, where Lily was painting soft blue waves onto the corner of a canvas. She looked up and smiled. Do you think we could make cookies later? She asked. I smiled back and said, absolutely. 3 months after that final Christmas, the Dempsey estate was officially listed for foreclosure, and the illusion they had carefully curated for decades crumbled in full public view. The bank took possession in early spring, and with it went everything they had once held over me like a crown, every chandelier, every marble countertop, every overpriced rug and inherited painting, every room that had once echoed with quiet judgment and polished hypocrisy. The lawn that used to be trimmed with military precision was suddenly overgrown, the gate rusted, the mailbox taped shut with foreclosure notices tucked inside like final verdicts. The house no longer looked regal, it looked abandoned, hollow, like the family it once contained. Jeff didn't fight the repossession. He couldn't. With the development dead and his accounts seized or frozen due to investor lawsuits, he had no cash, no partners, no credit. The project that was supposed to make him a king had turned into a financial corpse, and there was no one left to breathe life into it. He didn't land in some sleek condo or tucked away rental with a view of the water. Instead, he moved back in with Patricia and Richard, into the same tiny rental they had hastily secured after the reverse mortgage default triggered the asset seizure on their estate. A boxy single-story house with peeling paint, a cracked driveway, and a leaky roof. Less than 1,200 square feet, barely enough room for 2 people who couldn't stand each other, let alone a disgraced adult son who had lost everything but his arrogance. Patricia, who once boasted about never lifting a finger in her life, who used to say her hands were not made for labor, got a job at the local grocery store, working behind the deli counter. I saw the listing by chance, weeks after she started. Part-time, no benefits, minimum wage. Word got around quickly, people in that town always talked, but I never went to see for myself. I didn't need to. The image of her, forced to wear a smock and a plastic hairnet, carefully slicing cold cuts for customers who used to be her peers, was enough. She had once lived for image, for social rank, for being the matriarch of something larger than herself. Now she stood under fluorescent lights, printing discount stickers for half-pound orders of turkey breast. Richard kept mostly out of sight. Whatever pride he had left had been gutted the moment the house was lost. I never heard directly from him, not once. But I heard from them, together, in the only way they still knew how to speak to me, through carefully crafted performance disguised as humility. The letter arrived in early April, in a plain envelope with no return address but unmistakable handwriting. Patricia's, curled unpracticed, though shakier now. Inside was a single page, no stationery, just ruled paper folded in thirds. The tone was almost reverent, meek, apologetic, filled with phrases like time to reflect, deep remorse, family should never let go of each other. But it wasn't written for me. Not really. Every line was about Lily. How they missed her. How they thought of her every day. How Jeff regretted not making more of an effort. How Richard had kept a photo by his chair. How they wished, just wished, they could see her again, even just once. She must be growing up so fast, Patricia wrote. We would love to send a small gift if that's appropriate. I read it once, all the way through, standing at the kitchen counter. There were no admissions. No direct apologies. No acknowledgement of what they had taken. No reference to the humiliation, the trust, the betrayal, the years of cruelty. Just revisionist grief framed as family nostalgia, the kind that pretends harm never happened. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel satisfaction either. I felt nothing, because that part of me, whatever hope or ache they had once been able to stir, was already gone. I scanned the letter into my records, more for documentation than sentiment, then filed the original into a folder marked Dempsey, archived. I didn't shred it. I didn't reply. I didn't even mention it to Lily. And that was it. There were no more calls. No more emails. No sudden appearances. They had finally run out of avenues, of excuses, of financial levers to pull. Everything they had pretended to be, respected, powerful, untouchable, had disintegrated. Their names, once whispered in country clubs and fundraisers with a kind of reverence, were now only spoken in gossip, in cautionary tones, in past tense. And I, once their cautionary tale, had become something else entirely, someone who had walked away, shut the door behind me, and never once looked back. After everything settled, after the house was gone, the trust was repaired, and the final letter was quietly filed away, I took a long look at our life and realized we needed more than just distance from the Dempseys. We needed light. We needed space. We needed air that didn't smell like old money and decaying expectations. So I sold our little house, closed out the last of the accounts that tied us to that town, and relocated us to Sarasota, Florida, where the sun felt honest and the salt in the air seemed to scrub everything raw and clean. It wasn't a dramatic move. There was no announcement, no symbolic farewell. Just 2 suitcases, a moving truck filled with what little we cared to keep, and a lease on a modest but bright little bungalow 10 minutes from the water. It had a white fence, a small porch, and a backyard where Lily could run barefoot without worrying about being told not to stain the grass. The first night, we sat on the porch eating grilled cheese and watermelon, and she said, "This feels like vacation, but it's real." I told her that's exactly what I wanted. I enrolled her in a public school just a few blocks away, one with teachers who knew her name by the second day and a classroom filled with children who didn't care about last names or family trees. She made friends quickly. The kind of friends who shared snacks and passed silly notes and invited her to birthday parties with homemade cake. She started laughing more, loudly, freely, with her whole chest like she was making up for every moment she'd spent shrinking herself to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. Most afternoons, we walked to the beach. She collected seashells like treasures, sorting them into jars by size and color. Some days we stayed until sunset, letting the water wrap around our ankles as the sky turned orange and pink. She would talk about the clouds, the tides, the birds, anything and everything, but never about them. She didn't ask where they were. She didn't mention Jeff or Patricia or that awful house with the big tree and the bigger silences. It was as if those memories had been packed away and stored in some dusty attic that she had no reason to revisit. We built new routines, Saturday pancakes, Sunday farmers markets, quiet reading nights on the couch. I started consulting again, part-time, choosing projects I cared about, nothing that drained me. We were never extravagant, but we were never stretched thin. We had enough. And enough, I had learned, was sacred. Then came Christmas. It was our first Christmas in the new house, and I let her help decorate everything. We hung garlands made of twine and cinnamon sticks, strung lights around the porch, baked sugar cookies shaped like stars and dolphins. There was no pressure to impress anyone, no judgment about what gifts were or weren't under the tree. We had each other. That was enough. On Christmas morning, while we unwrapped a few small presents and sipped hot cocoa by the window, Lily looked up at me with those wide, thoughtful eyes of hers and asked, "Is Grandma visiting this year?" I paused for just a second, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew the weight it carried. I looked at her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and said, "No, baby. Just us this year." She didn't frown. She didn't look confused or sad. She just smiled softly, then nodded and said, "Good. It's safer that way." And that was it. No further questions. No explanations needed. She went back to her cocoa, humming quietly to herself, and I sat there, watching her, knowing that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Not running. Not hiding. Just living, freely, quietly, honestly, in a life no longer shaped by someone else's idea of what we deserved.